All right, so let's get going on today's meeting. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to be wrapping up our look at Chapter 7, Long-Term Memory, Encoding, and Retrieval. So we began that last week and followed it up with Part 2, what happens when encoding and retrieval goes dark and you're have encoded and retrieved some very, very traumatic memories. And today we're going to spend just a little bit of time just wrapping it up to put a pin in it. A couple of last points that I wanted to make about some of the research that we talked about and some of the discussions that we had in class. And then we're going to pivot to Chapter 9, which is conceptual knowledge. So we'll leave memory behind as much as you can possibly leave memory behind as one of the core components of our cognition. And we'll focus on how is what we know, our knowledge, structured in our mind. So once again, we are looking at the structure of the human mind in this case. How are things linked together? How are things encoded? What are the relation between different concepts, different memories? Are memories holistically represented, or are they in pieces when they are stored? All of this is us trying to understand how does that human mind work and how is it all connected. So what we're going to do today for Chapter 7 is we're going to have a real quick memory reconstruction wrap up, mostly because in our discussions I realized there was something that I missed. It does happen occasionally. So I just wanted to go back and revisit it just to make sure that we understood the premises of reconstructive memory, and then pivot to the importance of learning how to write, the importance of learning how to communicate. So this is going to be a little bit of an aside, but you're going to see that it had a massive impact. So there are courses that you are required to take to make your writing better in the psychology major. They are vastly important, and learning how to write and how to communicate, as you're going to see, can have huge consequences. All right, so just to wrap up on memory reconstruction, last time we took a look at the idea that memory is constantly being reconstructed. Every time you remember something, you reconstruct that memory. So they're not simply accessed like files, but rather it's rewritten, remade, reconstructed with every single recall. And we saw how in the case of Genevieve, who survived a sexual assault, how that premise, that idea, that theory was being used to help her reduce the emotional impact of these traumatic memories. So every single time those memories were reconstructed, they were placed into a more vulnerable position, and then using propranolol, I believe it was, they were able to inhibit the re-encoding of the emotional aspects of her memory and bringing down that memory impact or the emotionality of the memory by about 30% in her case. Yep. Say it again. Propranolol. Yeah, there we go. Propranolol. Thank you. All right. So on that note, we had that demonstration about memory reconstruction and with the associated word lists where everything was, all the words were associated with the word sleep, but sleep wasn't presented. And then if you remembered sleep, you remembered a false memory. So this was to kind of counter the idea that we have a filing system. There's no way that we represent our memories. And if you want to retrieve, for example, a list of words, you just go to the file where that list of words is, and then you just simply start pulling files out of that filing cabinet, out of that file location, and you start pulling all the words: bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, and drowsy. And the idea that was brought up was, well, isn't it possible that the filing system is still working as a filing system? Your mind is still working as a filing system, but what you did is you went to that file and just grabbed a whole bunch of files, and it just happened that that was also where you had stored the idea of sleep. So the idea is that you went to this file location, and instead of just kind of picking and choosing files, you just went there and you said, okay, I'm just going to grab the whole file, all of the files that are in this drawer, and sleep just came along for the ride. And I missed the flaw in that argument when we were discussing it the first time. And what I missed is, where did we go to in order to get these files? So the kind of assumption underlying that argument was that we went to a file location, we went to a drawer that contains everything that we know related to sleep. So this filing drawer was just containing everything that we know that was related to sleep. And then, of course, if you grab all those files, sleep is going to come along with the ride. However, for this task, the idea was that we're not going to the file that has everything to do with sleep. We're going to the file location. We're going to that drawer that has words I just saw on the list. That's the drawer location that we went to, because we wouldn't want to go just to a sleep drawer, because that could produce more false alarms, more false memories than actual memories. We wanted to go to the location, that drawer that was the words I just saw on the list drawer. And then when we were recalling those, we would only recall the files that were in that particular location. And that really does not allow us to have sleep in that particular location. There should be no way that sleep was filed in that drawer, because the only files that were going into that drawer were the words I just saw on the list. So the fact that sleep made it in there suggests that this is not the way that our memory is organized. It's not organized in terms of files, file drawers with files inside of them. It's some different type of organization. And Roediger and McDermott, who were the kind of penultimate founders, I think, of reconstructed memory, you'll see what I mean in just a moment. They were the ones that suggested, well, maybe it's stored in pieces all over the place. And then as you're yanking the yawn file, and as you're reconstructing the drowsy file, and as you're reconstructing the slumber file, pieces of associated files come with it. And then those pieces all come together and they form that sleep folder. And that's why you misremember sleep as having occurred. So again, reconstructive, the filing, sorry, let me say that again. The file theory of memory is very, very good at explaining why you would remember things. It's good at explaining why you would forget certain things, but it is very poor at explaining why you would falsely remember certain things. And when this was the predominant underlying concept of how memory worked, the idea of false memories were almost an impossibility. The idea that you would misremember something or remember something that never happened was just an impossible thing. Sure, you could forget something that didn't happen, but how could you possibly create files where files never existed and remember something that actually never happened? So I mentioned Roediger and McDermott as the sort of penultimate founders of this idea. The reason for that is because the first place that I could ever find this idea was in a paper from 1959 by James Dease. And this is the paper on the prediction of occurrence of particular verbal intrusions in immediate recall. So anybody who has been in my P211 class is familiar with this article. And this article basically had the experiment where he presented individuals, subjects with lists of words that were all associated with a non-presented word, and showed that they would produce these false memories. They would produce these verbal intrusions in that immediate recall. This paper came out in 1959. In 1995, about 40 years later, Roediger and McDermott basically replicated Dease's study. They basically said, you know what, we found this paper, we're going to do it again, we're going to replicate this study, and then they published Creating False Memories, Remembering Words Not Presented in Lists. So why are we going through this little history lesson? We're going through this history lesson just to show you the impact and the importance of learning how to communicate well. Because if you read Dease's paper, it is really poorly written. I'll just say it that way. It is not very well written. It's confusing. It's not very well structured. It's difficult. It's a little bit obtuse, whatever you want to say. When you read it, it doesn't flow. When you read it, you have to reread sections twice. When you read it, it's difficult to comprehend exactly what is going on in this particular study. On the other hand, when you read Roediger and McDermott, it is very concise, it's very clear, it's very well organized, it's very well communicated, it is very well written, and it just kind of flows with the, while you're reading it, flows with the kind of argument that they're trying to make. It's very easy to track. Why is that important? Well, let's take a look at the impact that these articles have had. So on the y-axis there on the bottom, we have the decade that we're going to analyze. On the y-axis, going up, we have citations per decade. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with citations, what they are is they're the number of articles that use your article as a reference. So they're the number of published articles in the scientific literature that have put your article somewhere in the reference section. That's what a citation is. And they're a measure of the impact of your article, because the more articles that read your article and say, hey, this is important enough to be included in my paper, that's a measure of how much impact does your work actually have. So let's take a look at Dease. Dease is going to be in the red. And how many citations did Dease's honestly breakthrough research receive? Well, the answer is initially not that many. So it was published in 1959. It's hard to get any citations in the 50s, but barely any citations in the 60s, barely any citations in the 70s, barely any citations in the 80s. Dease's work was basically ignored. Started to pick up a little bit in the 90s. And the reason it started to pick up a little bit in the 90s was that was when Roediger and McDermott's paper was published. And Roediger and McDermott basically said, we replicated Dease's study. So Roediger and McDermott's study had a huge impact where thousands of articles read it, thousands of researchers read it, thousands of articles were published where they said, this is important. We are going to include this article in our research. And what happened to Dease's article as a result of that was that its citations and its impact also increased. So if you take a look at Dease's citations now, they're in the thousands. Roediger and McDermott are in the thousands as well. But most of Dease's citations came after people read Roediger and McDermott's paper on false memories. So why am I bringing this up? Why am I bringing up the importance of good writing? The well-written paper had way more impact, way more citations. The poorly written paper was virtually ignored for decades. The reason that I'm mentioning it is because of a few things that could have potentially been avoided if Dease's work had made more impact when it was released. So if Dease could have had more citations in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and his ideas could have been starting to spread through our culture, spread through academia, spread through, for example, law enforcement, spread through the mainstream ideas, well, then something like what happened in the 80s with the Satanic Panic might have been avoided, or at least it might have been ameliorated. So for those of you that might not have heard of the Satanic Panic, this was a moral panic where 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse in North America were made. People were being accused, daycares were being accused of basically using children in satanic rituals, and it was just this moral panic. And it came about, I don't know exactly how it started, but much of the testimony and much of the witnesses were basically coached into having false memories. They were highly suggestible people. In many cases, they were children, and they were basically unintentionally, I believe, coached into remembering abuse and rituals that never occurred. And again, in the 1980s, the idea that somebody could remember something falsely that never occurred was just unheard of. You had a filing system. and you were accessing these files, and maybe they were lost for a while, but now we've recovered these files, and oh my goodness, look what they're doing to our children in daycare. If Dease had written better, this might have been avoided if people were aware of the fact that we could have those false memories. That wasn't the only one that occurred in the late 80s, early 90s. We also had the false recovered memories epidemic, where people would recall alleged child sexual abuse, and that became a massive problem because they were actually false memories. So in therapy, people would be searching for what it is that is causing their issues, their anxiety, their depression. And therapists would start suggesting things. They would start thinking like, well, do you remember in your childhood, did anybody, touch you in an inappropriate way? And they would say no. And they were like, do you remember, did anybody do this? Did anybody do that? And every single time they were doing that, they were basically planting or putting in a memory that was associated with child abuse. And eventually, much like we misremembered sleep in our list, eventually, after a lot of those questions, they would falsely remember an incident of child abuse. And again, the idea that you could falsely remember something was not something that was mainstream, not something that was well known until after Roeder and McDermott's work. And just to give you an idea of how easy this is to do, just to give you an idea of how easy it is to plant a memory in somebody. There was a study, I believe it was done by Elizabeth Loftus. She is this wonderful researcher on false memories. We're actually going to see some of her work today. She did an experiment where she would ask a child, she asked a child about things that occurred in their childhood. So they would be like, well, tell me about the things that occurred in your childhood. And the child would be like, well, I went to the amusement park once. She'd be like, okay, tell me about the amusement park. So they would tell them about the amusement park and it'd be like, tell me something else. Well, I remember, me and my family went to the beach. And she'd be like, okay, that's great. Tell me about the beach. And then she would say, tell me about the time you got lost at the mall. And in the first interview, that child was looked at her and said, I never got lost at the mall. My parents never lost me at the mall. And Elizabeth Loftus was like, okay. Came back for another interview. Tell me about your amusement park. Oh yeah, blah, 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 this, and this. Tell me about the beach. Oh yeah, blah, 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 this, and this. Tell me about that time you got lost at the mall. Oh, I never got lost at the mall. Okay. Next interview, does it again. Next interview, does it again. I don't know how many times it took, maybe 5, 6, or 7 interviews, but eventually Loftus, never suggesting anything other than tell me the time you got lost at the mall. Eventually, on one of the later interviews, that child said, yeah, I remember. I was like 5, and there was this toy store that I always wanted to go into, but my parents didn't want me to go into, so they said to stay close. But I went into the toy store, and after I came out, I couldn't find them, and I started crying, and this nice policeman came. Details, everything, entire story. All she ever did was ask him, tell me about the time he got lost at the mall. And it was a false memory. And when she tried to correct him at the end of the experiment and played the interview tapes of him denying that he ever got lost at the mall, he would not believe that that was a false memory because it was just so richly implanted. Again, not surprising to Roediger and McDermott, but could have been not something that popped into our knowledge in 1995. If Dease had written better, could have been there in 1959, could have avoided the satanic panic, could have avoided those false recovered memories. And it's just, if you're ever interested in taking a look at just the massive impact of this, how many lives were destroyed by false accusations in the satanic panic? How many families were ripped apart because memories that had never occurred, false memories were quote unquote recovered? It's just a rabbit hole that you can see the massive impact that something like that can have. So there's this nice little review paper, The Fallibility of Memory in Judicial Processes, Lessons from the Past and Modern Consequences, about how witness testimony in our judicial process can have consequences in terms of falsely remembering things that then affect people's lives and people's freedom. So again, knowing how to write, learning how to write, massively important. The impact that it can have. Basically, if Deese wrote better, we would have advanced psychological understanding of memory by 40 years. But we had to wait until Roediger and McDermott did the exact same experiment that Deese did, found the exact same findings that Deese did, wrote it up well, and then it had that impact. All right, any final questions before we leave memory behind? All right. Oh, yep. Probably yes. I would think so. It would be it would be interesting to know if there were any researchers that were just going through papers that were poorly cited and just looking for, can I just redo this experiment because everybody has ignored it and I'll just redo it and rewrite it. It would be interesting to know if there was anybody that could build your career on just unearthing these treasures of forgotten wisdom and forgotten findings. Um, it's one of these really interesting things in science. One of the things that a lot of people in science forget about science is that scientists are people, and they have all the fallibilities and strengths and weaknesses of people. So 40 years, people looked at Deese's work and said, I can't read this, on to the next one, right? This is just troublesome, it's hard to read, I don't want to read it. You would think a scientist would be like, well, no, this is important, I'm going to go through it. Or maybe they went through it, but they just couldn't kind of grasp it because it wasn't written well. Um, Scientists are people, and you have to know that and understand that. So it is quite possible that there were some excellent psychology scientists who did excellent research and just did not have the ability to write it up in a convincing way. So yeah, there could be this treasure trove of things that have not been found, and the the difficulty in there, and actually this is maybe somewhere where AI could work. The difficulty would be, how do you find the gold amongst probably the hundreds of papers that really just didn't have much impact or didn't have much work? It reminds me of this um, author's paper, this short story by Jorge Borges, I believe, Borges, and he wrote this book. I think it's called The Library of Babylon, but it's definitely about a library, and it's about a library where it has every single book that could ever be written, of 256 pages, I believe, long. So basically, it's a random assortment of letters that fill 256 pages, and they're all in this library. They all exist in this library. So, what's in this library? Well, the cure for cancer is in the library, right? There is a book out there that will give you the cure for cancer, because that's a possible thing that you could write in 256 pages. Your autobiography, well, not your autobiography, your unauthorized biography is in that library, including what's going to happen to you in 20 years, right? That's in the library. Your future predicted book is in the library. But what's also in that library is your unauthorized biography that gets the details of your birth wrong, and your unauthorized biography that has you attending IU Bloomington instead of IU South Bend, right? So, and then books that are just gibberish. So the idea, he goes through a lot of like the philosophical implications of this. It's a short read, but it's massively interesting. But the idea is that most of that library is just garbage, just absolute garbage. But in there are just things that would be world changing if you could find them. So interesting idea, but I think that would be one of the problems of how do we do it. But I mean, if we have AI with massive processing, we could literally say, well, here's this journal, take a look at all the articles that have been ignored, what do you think is the top one, and let's just try to replicate that. Any other questions? Yep. I would just kind of based on the research that I have read, I haven't read massive amounts into the false memory literature, but there is no way that I know that people are able to identify a false memory versus a real memory. So it's not like you're not more confident in real memories than you are in false memories. You don't recall real memories faster than you recall false memories. So I would say that to the extent that you can't forget a real memory, you're stuck with your false memory. So he could learn and eventually be convinced that no, that is something that actually never happened to you, right? The same way that sometimes you might remember something and then you're like, oh, wait a second, no, that was a dream, right? Like that was a very vivid dream that I have. Like you still kind of remember it, but you're able to say, no, that's not actually true and that actually didn't happen. But he is probably stuck with that story, untrue as it is and untrue as he might eventually realize that it is, but he's probably still stuck with it in all the details. So I hope it wasn't too traumatic when he got lost at the mall, because as we're going to see today, these types of associations that we have between thoughts affect how you behave and affect how you think. So the fact that he got lost in that mall is associated with the people that lost him, his parents. So now his relationship with them has changed and his views of them have changed. And as much as you might be able to say, well, no, that's not the real thing that actually happened, a lot of those associations that are there will remain there and will still impact how you process things. Yeah. Any other final thoughts? All right.